George Washington Carver was born into a world that had already decided what his life should be. He was born into slavery during the American Civil War, in Missouri, sometime in the early 1860s. The exact date is not known. His mother, Mary, was enslaved on the farm of Moses Carver. George was taken from her when he was still a baby. He was later raised by Moses and Susan Carver. He was a small, quiet child who seemed drawn to plants. While other children played, George often wandered into the woods. He watched leaves change. He studied flowers. He noticed how seeds grew after rain. And when a plant was sick, he wanted to know why. People in the area began calling him the plant doctor. They brought him damaged plants, and George tried to help them. He did not have a laboratory. He did not have expensive equipment. He had curiosity. And he had time. He would collect plants and place them in a small garden. He experimented with soil, water, sunlight, and natural materials. He wanted to understand how things worked. But George Carver was growing up in a country where education was difficult for black children. The Civil War ended slavery, but freedom did not mean equality. Schools for black children were limited. Opportunities were rare. And George wanted something that many people around him could not easily obtain: an education. So he left home. He traveled from place to place, looking for schools that would accept him. Sometimes he was refused because of his race. Sometimes he had almost no money. But he kept going. He worked for food. He washed clothes. He cooked. He took whatever work he could find. Then he studied. At one point, he attended Simpson College in Iowa, where he first studied art. His paintings showed his talent. He could draw flowers with great detail. But his interest in plants kept pulling him back. He eventually transferred to Iowa State Agricultural College, now Iowa State University. There, he studied agriculture and botany. He became the first black student to earn a bachelor's degree there and later earned a master's degree. His teachers noticed his ability. He was not simply interested in memorizing facts. He wanted to understand nature. He wanted to experiment. And he wanted to use science to help people. Then an important invitation arrived. Booker T. Washington, the leader of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, asked Carver to join the school. Carver accepted. In 1896, he arrived at Tuskegee. He would remain there for the rest of his life. Tuskegee was not a wealthy school. Carver's laboratory was modest. His equipment was limited. But he had students. And he had land. Most importantly, he had a purpose. He wanted to help poor farmers. Many black farmers in the South depended heavily on cotton. Cotton could bring money, but growing the same crop year after year damaged the soil. The soil lost important nutrients. Farmers often had little money for fertilizer. And many were trapped in poverty. Carver believed there was a practical answer. The answer was not simply to grow more cotton. Farmers needed to grow different crops. They needed to rotate crops. They needed to improve the soil. And they needed crops that could provide food and useful products. Carver encouraged farmers to plant crops such as peanuts, sweet potatoes, cowpeas, and other legumes. These crops could help improve soil fertility. But there was another problem. If farmers grew more peanuts, what would they do with them? Carver began experimenting. He studied peanuts. He studied sweet potatoes. He studied plants and their chemical properties. He searched for useful products that could be made from crops. His laboratory became a place of constant activity. There were jars, bottles, plants, seeds, soil samples, handwritten notes, and the smell of chemicals and earth. Carver worked with intense concentration. He did not care much about luxury. He cared about the work. He believed that science should serve ordinary people. That belief shaped his career. Carver eventually became famous for his work with peanuts. But there is an important detail that is often forgotten. Carver did not invent the peanut, and he did not invent hundreds of modern peanut products in the way popular stories sometimes suggest. His real contribution was broader. He helped promote agricultural diversification and demonstrated many possible uses for crops. He developed and taught methods for using peanuts, sweet potatoes, and other plants in farming and education. He wanted farmers to see crops as more than something they sold. A crop could be food. It could improve soil. It could provide useful materials. And it could create another source of income. Carver produced bulletins and recipes for farmers and families. He explained how peanuts and sweet potatoes could be used in different ways. He wanted farmers to become less dependent on one crop. That idea mattered. But Carver's work was not only about peanuts. He studied plants, dyes, paints, oils, medicines, soaps, adhesives, and he experimented with natural materials that many people ignored. A weed could become a source of color. A plant could produce oil. A crop could become a useful material. Carver looked at ordinary things and asked unusual questions. What is inside this plant? What can it become? How can a farmer use it? How can this help someone with very little money? Those questions guided his work. And then there was the soil. Carver understood that healthy farming began with healthy soil. Cotton had been grown heavily across the South for generations. The land needed better management. Carver encouraged crop rotation. Planting legumes could help restore nitrogen to the soil. Farmers could alternate crops instead of exhausting the land with continuous cotton production. It was not a magic solution. Poverty did not disappear. Farmers still faced unfair prices, debt, limited land ownership, but Carver gave people practical knowledge they could use. He also created what became known as the Jessup agricultural wagon. The idea was simple. Instead of expecting farmers to travel to the school, bring agricultural information directly to them. The wagon carried demonstrations and educational materials. It traveled through rural communities. Farmers could see new methods. They could ask questions. And they could learn about soil, crops, and farming techniques. Carver understood that scientific knowledge was useful only if people could access it. A discovery locked inside a laboratory could not help a farmer who never heard about it. So he taught. Again and again. He gave lectures. He wrote bulletins. He worked with students. He answered questions. And he kept experimenting. His reputation grew. People began hearing about the quiet scientist at Tuskegee who could turn plants into useful materials. Soon, wealthy and powerful people wanted to meet him. Thomas Edison offered Carver a position at his laboratory. Carver declined. He wanted to remain at Tuskegee. He believed his work belonged there. Later, Henry Ford became interested in Carver's experiments with agricultural material. Carver and Ford shared an interest in finding useful products from plants. Carver's work also attracted attention from other scientists, businessmen, and political leaders. But fame did not seem to change him. He continued to live simply. He continued teaching. He continued walking through fields. And he continued looking closely at plants. One of the most striking parts of Carver's life was his attitude toward knowledge. He did not see science and nature as separate from his personal beliefs. His faith was important to him. He often spoke about nature as something that revealed a deeper order. For Carver, studying a plant was not only a scientific activity. It was also a way of understanding creation. That belief gave his work a personal meaning. But his life was not easy. He lived during an era of intense racial discrimination. He faced barriers because he was black. He worked in a country where segregation was legal in many places. Violence and racial injustice were part of everyday life for millions of black Americans. Carver rarely responded with anger in public. Instead, he focused on teaching and research. That does not mean the world around him was fair. It was not. His achievements were remarkable partly because of the barriers he had to overcome. The boy who had been born into slavery became a respected scientist and teacher. That journey alone would have been extraordinary. But Carver did not stop with his own success. He wanted students to succeed too. At Tuskegee, he trained young people in agriculture and science. He encouraged them to observe, to experiment, to ask questions, to learn from mistakes. He believed that education could give people more control over their lives. And he believed farming could be improved through knowledge. Years passed. Carver became one of the best-known black scientists in America. But the public image of Carver sometimes became larger than the real person. Stories spread about hundreds of peanut inventions. Some claims were exaggerated. Some products were never widely used. Some stories were simplified over time. The real Carver was more interesting than the legend. He was not simply a man who found hundreds of things to do with peanuts. He was a scientist, teacher, agricultural researcher, and educator who believed that useful knowledge should reach ordinary people. He studied the relationship between crops and soil. He encouraged farmers to diversify. He researched plant products. He taught generations of students. And he spent much of his life at Tuskegee. In 1921, Carver was invited to speak before the United States Congress. He demonstrated products made from peanuts. The hearing gave him national attention. He spoke calmly and explained his work. People who had never heard of him before began to understand what he had been doing. But Carver did not become obsessed with fame. He returned to his work. His laboratory remained his world. There was always another plant to study, another experiment to conduct, another student to teach, another farmer who needed information. As he grew older, his health began to decline. Yet he continued working. He continued teaching when he could. He continued answering letters. And he continued encouraging young people to study science. Carver died at Tuskegee in 1943. He was around 80 years old. He had begun life under slavery. He died as a respected scientist whose name was known across the country. After his death, Tuskegee established the George Washington Carver National Monument in Missouri. It became the first national monument dedicated to an African American. But perhaps the strongest part of Carver's legacy is not a statue or a laboratory. It is an idea. Look closely. Ask questions. Use what you have. And do not assume that something is useless simply because it looks ordinary. Carver saw possibility in plants. He saw possibility in poor soil. He saw possibility in students who had been denied opportunities. And he saw possibility in himself, even when the world around him offered very little encouragement. His story began in a small Missouri community. It passed through difficult schools, hard work, and years of study. It led him to Tuskegee. There, surrounded by fields and simple laboratory equipment, he spent decades trying to make science useful. He did not become famous because he wanted attention. He became famous because he kept working. The peanut became part of his public image. But the deeper story was about agriculture. It was about education. It was about soil. It was about opportunity. And it was about turning knowledge into something people could use. Carver once looked at a small seed and saw more than food. He saw a question. What can this become? That question was at the heart of his life. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. Because sometimes progress begins with something very small. A seed. A plant. A question. A young person who refuses to stop learning. George Washington Carver showed what could happen when curiosity meets patience. He also showed that science does not have to begin with a huge laboratory. Sometimes it begins with a person standing in a field, looking at a plant, and wondering why it grows the way it does. And then asking one more question. What else can it do?